The wind on the plains carried secrets. It whispered through the tall grass, speaking of drought and hardship, of ghosts and grievances. Hinto, a Lakota woman whose name meant blue for the color of a twilight sky, knew its language well. It had been her only companion for 3 years, ever since the fever had stolen her husband and son, leaving her heart a hollow vessel in the silent shell of her cabin. She was gathering sage near the bluffs that marked the edge of her solitary world when the wind brought a new sound. It was not the cry of a hawk or the complaint of a coyote. It was thin, reedy, and full of a pain so sharp it pierced the calm of the afternoon. Hinto followed the sound, her moccasins making no noise on the dry earth. She moved past a cluster of sun-bleached rocks and there, against the harsh line of a barbed wire fence that belonged to a cattleman she'd never met, she saw it. A child. A little girl, no older than 6, was tied to a fence post. Her wrists were bound with rough twine, the skin beneath rubbed raw and bleeding. Her clothes, strange silk trousers and a tunic, were torn and filthy. Her face was smudged with dirt and tears, and her black hair was matted with sweat. She was Chinese, a face Hinto had only seen from a distance among the crews laying down the iron tracks that were scarring the land. The girl's eyes were closed, her small chest barely rising and falling. The sun beat down on her without mercy, a relentless hammer. Hinto felt a cold fury mix with a sorrow so profound it threatened to bring her to her knees. Who could do this? Who could leave a child, any child, staked out like an animal, left for the sun and the predators to claim? Her own grief, a sleeping bear in the cave of her soul, stirred and growled. She saw the ghost of her own son's face in the girl's exhausted features. The choice wasn't a choice at all. It was an imperative, a command from whatever spirit still watched over the broken people of this land. She approached slowly, making a soft shushing sound. The girl's eyes fluttered open, black and deep with a terror that knew no language. Hinto simply pointed to the ropes, then to her knife, and then to her own chest. "I will help," she said, her voice rough from disuse. The word was Lakota, but the meaning was carried in her gaze. Hinto's knife, usually reserved for skinning rabbits or cutting herbs, sliced through the rough twine with a single, decisive stroke. The little girl crumpled forward, her small body giving up the last of its strength. Hinto caught her before she hit the dusty ground, lifting her into her arms. She was lighter than a bundle of dry sticks, a fragile bird with broken wings. The heat radiating from the child's skin spoke of fever, a dangerous fire burning through her. Hinto wasted no more time. She turned her back on the cruel fence and the empty prairie and carried the girl toward the sanctuary of her cabin. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of dried herbs and wood smoke. It was a place of mourning, but now, for the first time in years, it would be a place of healing. She laid the child on her own sleeping pallet, a soft bed of buffalo and deer hides. She worked with a focused tenderness she thought had been buried with her family. She trickled water from a gourd between the girl's cracked lips, watching the small throat work to swallow. She cleaned the raw wounds on her wrists with a poultice of yarrow and covered them with soft cloth. The girl drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering in a language that sounded like chiming bells and sharp stones, a torrent of fear and pain Hinto could not understand but could feel in her own bones. For 2 days, Hinto did not sleep. She bathed the girl's feverish brow, forced broth into her mouth, and hummed the old lullabies her own mother had sung to her. In the flickering firelight, the girl's face would sometimes morph, and for a heart-stopping moment, Hinto would see her son, his dark eyes looking up at her. The grief was a fresh wound again, but it was different now. It was no longer a paralyzing emptiness. It was a fire, fueling a fierce, protective instinct that spread through her like a prairie blaze. This child, dropped into her life by a cruel fate, was breathing life back into the hollow spaces of Hinto's world. She did not know her name or her story, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty: she would not let this world harm her again. The child was hers now. On the 3rd day, the fever broke. The girl awoke with clear, intelligent eyes, still frightened, but the delirium was gone. It was also on the 3rd day that trouble arrived, riding 2 horses and kicking up a cloud of arrogant dust. Sheriff Brody and his young deputy, Cale, reined in their horses in front of Hinto's cabin. Brody was a man whose size was matched only by his swagger. He had a bloated face, a cruel twist to his mouth, and a silver star on his chest that seemed to mock the very idea of justice. His gaze swept over Hinto's small, well-kept home with open contempt. "Hinto," he said, not as a greeting but as a summons. "I hear you found something that don't belong to you." Hinto stepped out of her doorway, blocking his view of the interior. She stood straight, her presence far larger than her physical frame. "I found a child left to die," she replied, her voice steady and cold. Brody laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You found railroad property. A stray." One of the Chinese laborers ran off, left his baggage behind. His eyes, small and hard like pebbles, tried to peer past her into the cabin's shadows. "The railroad baron, Mr. Thorne, pays me a handsome fee for keeping his affairs in order. That includes rounding up his runaways and his property. I'm here for the girl." The word girl came out of his mouth like an insult, coated in a slime of casual cruelty. He dismounted, his boots crunching on the gravel, a clear act of intimidation. Young Cale stayed on his horse, his face unreadable, his eyes shifting nervously between the sheriff and the resolute Lakota woman. Hinto didn't flinch. She had faced down starving wolves and bitter blizzards. A man puffed up with his own importance was just another kind of beast. "She is not property," Hinto said, the words quiet but immovable. "She is a child. She stays with me." Brody's smile vanished, replaced by a mask of pure menace. He took a step closer, his shadow falling over her. "You don't get to make the rules here, squaw. This is a white man's town, with white man's laws." The air grew thick with unspoken violence. Sheriff Brody's hand drifted down, coming to rest on the butt of his pistol, a gesture that was both a promise and a threat. "That girl is a complication," he snarled, his voice dropping to a low growl. "A piece of trash left over from the work crews. She has no papers, no family, no name. She's worth less than the dust on my boots. But Mr. Thorne wants his accounts tidy. So you are going to hand her over?" Behind him, Deputy Cale shifted in his saddle, his discomfort a palpable thing. He was young, barely 20, and the star on his own vest seemed too heavy for him. He had signed on to uphold the law, but he was beginning to suspect he had only signed on to uphold Brody's will. Hinto's hand moved, not towards a weapon, but to the simple leather pouch at her belt. Her fingers brushed against the smooth, worn stone inside, a stone her husband had given her for protection. It offered no physical defense, but it connected her to his strength, his courage. She drew that strength now. Her chin lifted. "No," she said. The word was a rock against which Brody's threats broke like water. "She stays here. This is my home. On this land, I make the rules." Brody's face turned a mottled red, his fury barely contained. He was not a man accustomed to being defied, least of all by a native woman living on the fringes of society. "You have until sundown," he spat, spittle flying from his lips. "You bring that little heathen to my office in town. If you don't, I will come back here with my deputies, and we will burn this pathetic shack to the ground with you inside it. Do you understand me?" He leaned in, his foul breath washing over her. "I am the law with that." He turned, swung himself back onto his horse with a grunt, and spurred the animal away without a backward glance. Cale hesitated for a moment, his eyes meeting Hinto's. In them, she saw a flicker of something, shame, doubt, fear, before he quickly looked away and followed his boss. Hinto stood watching them go, the dust settling around her. The ultimatum hung in the air, heavy as a shroud. But fear was a luxury she could no longer afford. She had someone to protect. She went back inside, the weight of the coming battle settling on her shoulders. That night, a storm rolled in from the west, the sky turning the color of a deep bruise. Thunder muttered in the distance, a low growl that echoed the turmoil in Hinto's heart. Inside the cabin, she sat with the little girl by the fire. The child, who Hinto had begun to call Leon after hearing her whisper the name in her fevered sleep, was no longer just a frightened victim. A quiet strength was beginning to surface. She tugged on Hinto's sleeve, her small face serious. She pointed to herself. Lien, she said clearly. Then she pointed to Hinto. Hinto touched her own chest. Hinto, a fragile bridge of names was built between them in the flickering light. Then, Lien's expression clouded over. She picked up a charred stick from the hearth and began to draw in the dirt floor. Her small hands moved with a desperate urgency. She drew a crude stick figure of a man, a large, round man. She jabbed the stick at it, her eyes flashing with a mixture of fear and anger. "Bad man," she whispered, one of the few English words she seemed to know. Then she drew a fire, big and wild. Next to it, she drew two smaller figures, a man and a woman, her parents. She drew the big man taking them away, into the darkness, while the fire burned. Then she drew herself, small and alone, and a rope. She looked up at Hinto, her eyes filling with tears, and pointed to the drawing of the big man again. This time, she didn't say bad man, she spoke a different word, one she must have heard clearly in the chaos. Brody, she said. The name was a curse on her tongue. A cold dread washed over Hinto, colder than any winter wind. It all clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Lien hadn't been abandoned by a runaway father. She was a witness. Brody hadn't been rounding up stray property, he had been silencing the last person who saw his crime. Her parents, likely organizers or dissenters among the Chinese workers, had been eliminated, and he had left their child to die a slow, silent death in the wilderness. He wasn't just a corrupt sheriff. He was a murderer. The revelation struck Hinto with the force of a physical blow. The fight was not about sheltering an orphan anymore. It was about protecting the only witness to a monstrous crime, a secret Brody would kill to keep buried. Sundown was no longer just a deadline, it was a death sentence. Looking at Lien, who had curled up against her side, seeking warmth and safety, Hinto felt the last vestiges of her isolated grief burn away, replaced by a righteous fury. The spirits of her ancestors, warriors who had fought and died for their people and their land, seemed to cry out in her blood. Her husband had been a man who never backed down from injustice. How could she, his wife, do any less? She could not run. Where would they go? Brody's power extended for miles, and they would be hunted down in the open prairie. No, the fight had to be here. In her home. A fortress of memory and now, of defiance. She stood up, her movements filled with new purpose. She went to the heavy wooden chest at the foot of her pallet. She lifted the lid, the scent of cedar and thyme filling the small room. Beneath folded blankets lay her husband's possessions, his war shirt, his ceremonial pipe, and at the very bottom, his repeating rifle, carefully cleaned and oiled. She had not touched it since his death. It felt impossibly heavy in her hands, not just with its own weight, but with the weight of what it represented. She was a healer, a gatherer, a widow. She had not sought this war, but it had come to her door. She checked the rifle's action, her hands moving with a remembered certainty. She found the small box of cartridges and laid them out on the table. She barricaded the door with the heavy table and wedged a log against the single window shutter. Her small cabin, once a haven of quiet sorrow, was now a bulwark against a tide of pure evil. She would not let the darkness have this child. She would make her stand. As the sun began its final, bloody descent, staining the clouds orange and purple, Hinto saw the dust cloud on the horizon. It was larger this time. Brody had brought his posse. She counted for riders with him, their forms silhouetted against the dying light like harbingers of doom. She held Lien close, whispering reassurances in Lakota, the soothing sounds of the words more important than their meaning. The child did not cry. She clung to Hinto, her small body trembling but her eyes fixed on Hinto's face, drawing strength from the woman's calm resolve. The riders circled the cabin once, their horses trampling the small herb garden Hinto tended so carefully. Then they stopped, a semicircle of menace. Brody's voice boomed across the clearing, amplified by the evening quiet. Hinto! I gave you a choice. You chose poorly. He held up a lit torch, the flames dancing greedily in the twilight. I'm a man of my word. Give me the Chinese chit now, and I'll let you live. Last chance. Hinto looked through a small crack in the wall. She saw their faces, cruel and eager, illuminated by the torchlight. They were predators, ready for the kill. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear and defiance. She had the rifle, but she was one woman against 5 armed men. It was an impossible fight. Surrender meant sending Lian to her death. Fighting meant they would both die here, in fire and smoke. It was a choice between 2 endings, both of them tragic. What a terrible corner of the world this was, where the only choice left for a good person was how to die. And right now, I have to ask you, what would you do? When you are surrounded by evil, with no hope of rescue, do you surrender your principles to survive, or do you stand for what is right, even if it means your own destruction? Think about it. What does true courage look like in a moment like that? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, because what happens next is a testament to the human spirit. And make sure you are subscribed, because you won't want to miss the spark that ignites the fire of rebellion. Just as Sheriff Brody raised his arm to give the signal, a whip-crack sound echoed from the rocky ridge that overlooked the cabin. It wasn't thunder. It was a rifle shot. The man holding the second torch cried out and dropped it, clutching his shoulder. Panic and confusion rippled through Brody's men. They spun around, searching the darkening landscape for the source of the attack. "Who's out there?" Brody roared, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. Another shot rang out, kicking up dirt near Brody's horse, causing it to rear violently. From the shadows of the rocks, a figure emerged. It was Doc Miller. The town's weary, whiskey-soaked doctor, a man who spent his days patching up bar fights and delivering babies, now stood with a hunting rifle braced against his shoulder. His face was pale, but his hands were steady. He had seen Brody's posse ride out of town, armed for war, and something inside him, a piece of his conscience he thought long dead, had finally snapped. He couldn't abide another act of casual brutality, another life snuffed out for Brody's greed. He couldn't let Hinto and the child die alone. His presence wasn't an army. He was one man, well past his prime. But his single, unexpected act of defiance shattered the narrative. It broke the spell of Brody's absolute authority. It showed the other men that the sheriff was not invincible. Deputy Cale, who had been sitting his horse at the edge of the group, stared up at the doctor, then back at the cabin, then at his furious boss. The seed of doubt planted earlier that day began to sprout. He had seen the terror in the child's eyes when Hinto had first brought her to town for supplies. He had seen Hinto's fierce, maternal protection. And now he saw the town doctor risking his life to defend them. He was on the wrong side of this fight, and the knowledge settled in his gut like a cold stone. The doctor's shots gave Hinto the opening she needed. She couldn't win a sustained gunfight, but she could use the chaos. "Stay here," she whispered to Lian, pushing her gently into the safest corner of the cabin. "Do not make a sound." Then, taking a deep breath, she unbarred the door and burst out into the night. She didn't charge with the rifle blazing. She moved with a speed and ferocity that was utterly primal. She was not a soldier, she was a mother wolf defending her cub, a force of nature unleashed. Her sudden, unexpected appearance threw the posse into further disarray. One of the men, startled, turned his horse to face her, and in that moment of hesitation, Doc Miller's rifle cracked again, and the man's gun went flying from his hand. Hinto ran straight for the nearest man, who was fumbling to reload, and used the butt of her own rifle to knock him clean out of his saddle. The other men, seeing their friends taken down from 2 directions, lost their nerve. They were bullies and thugs, not soldiers. This wasn't the easy fight they had signed up for. 2 of them turned their horses and fled into the darkness, wanting no more part of it. The tide had turned. Now it was just Brody and Deputy Cale. Brody, consumed by a blinding rage, turned his pistol not on Hinto, but on the deputy. "You useless coward," he screamed, leveling the gun at Cale's chest. "You're all worthless." It was the moment of truth for Cale. The boyish fear on his face hardened into a man's resolve. He drew his own pistol with a speed that surprised even himself and aimed it squarely at the sheriff. "It's over, Brody," Cale said, his voice shaking but clear. It's all over. Enraged at the ultimate betrayal, Brody fired. But Hinto, anticipating the move, threw herself at him with all her might. They crashed to the ground in a tangle of limbs, the sheriff's shot going wild into the night sky. The fight was short, desperate, and ugly. Brody was bigger, but Hinto was fueled by 3 years of pain and a fierce, righteous love. In the end, it was Cale who pressed the barrel of his gun to Brody's temple, ending the struggle. The corrupt sheriff's reign of terror was over, brought down not by an army, but by the courage of a grieving widow, a tired old doctor, and a young man who finally chose to be the lawman he was supposed to be. 6 months later, the prairie was healing under the grace of a gentle spring. The town was healing, too. With Brody's arrest, a flood of his crimes came to light: extortion, theft, and the murder of Lian's parents, who had been trying to organize the Chinese workers for fair wages and safe conditions. The railroad baron, Mr. Thorne, quickly distanced himself, leaving Brody to face justice alone. Deputy Cale, now Sheriff Cale, was working to earn the town's trust, trying to build a community where justice was not just a word on a tin star. Up on the bluff, Hinto's life had color again. Her small cabin was no longer a tomb of memories but a home filled with the sound of Lian's laughter. The two of them had built a life together. Hinto taught Lian the names of the prairie flowers in Lakota and how to track rabbits. In return, Lian taught Hinto the few Chinese words for mother, home, and love. They were a strange and beautiful family, a testament to the fact that bonds forged in courage are stronger than any ties of blood. Doc Miller was a regular visitor, often bringing sweets for Lian and sharing a quiet cup of tea with Hinto, their shared ordeal creating a friendship of unspoken understanding. Even some of the townsfolk, their consciences pricked by the truth, would occasionally leave a sack of flour or a bolt of cloth on her doorstep, small acts of atonement. Hinto and Lian would sit outside in the evenings, watching the sky turn the shade of blue for which Hinto was named. Hinto knew the scars on both their hearts would never fully disappear. But they were no longer gaping wounds. They were part of their story, a story of survival, of love, and of defiance. The moral of this story is a powerful one. It teaches us that courage is contagious. The bravery of one person can awaken the honor in another and change the course of history. It proves that family is not defined by the color of our skin or the language we speak, but by the unconditional love and protection we offer to those in need. It reminds us that even in the darkest of times, a single light can be enough to drive out the shadows. If this story lit a fire in your heart, please subscribe to our channel for more tales of courage and redemption. And be sure to click on the next video that you see on your screen now. We have another incredible story waiting for you, one that will inspire you all over again.